Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Well, we think we've got an informative topic for you today. Here it is. The alphabet soup of agency approvals and certifications. Certainly, there are a lot of marks that you see on products these days. Certainly, that's true in automation. And what do they all mean? What is the difference between the standard or the certification? What is a nationally recognized test laboratory? What's that all about? Well, these are just some of the questions we're going to answer today in a very informal fashion. So this is not a deep dive into industrial standards or test standards or those sorts of things. This is just going to be a short video where we take a look at the common approvals, the common marks that you'll see on industrial products, and try and give you a good basic understanding of what they mean. All right. Now, because this is really such a simple topic, we're not even going to really break down the topic today. We're just going to dive right in. All right, so let's get started. Okay, let's start with standards organizations. And these are organizations that do just what it sounds like. They develop standards. They develop the standards and they publish the standards. And there are a number of these that we've heard of. And of course, they all have names that are acronyms, which always seems to happen, right? So, of course, we've all heard of ISO. There are a lot of, ISO 9000 type certifications out there for businesses in general. IEC is probably one of the biggest names in these sort of organizations in the industrial world. You'll see them publish a number of standards on things like contactors and everything else you can imagine. Of course, there's IEEE. All right, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, they set a lot of standards, things like different floating point data formats and those sorts of things. Certainly, if you're in the automotive industry, the Society of Automotive Engineers, I think they just call themselves SAE International these days, they set a lot of standards. At Horner, a lot of our products support J1939 protocol that's used in a variety of applications, including mobile and automotive, and the SAE International, I believe, had a heavy hand in that standard. And then, of course, ANSI is another one we've all heard of, the American National Standards Institute. So again, these are standards organizations. They're in charge of developing and publishing standards. Sometimes they also promote them. They're not in charge of certifying or anything of that nature. Okay, now let's start taking a look at some of the markings that you'll see on automation products, starting with ones that have their origin in Europe. So let's start with a big one, CE mark. Now, maybe 10 years into my career, CE was a big deal because at that time it was a new requirement. In order to sell your products in the EU, you needed to have CE mark. And it's not just an automation thing. It applies to toys. Really, any product that is sold in the EU requires CE mark. And these days, CE has kind of become pretty ubiquitous. So on the Horner website, for instance, we have CE declaration documents, not only for Europe, but also for US, because a lot of those same standards have been adopted elsewhere. Another mark you'll see on products that has its origin in Europe is ATEX. ATEX is short for, I think, a French phrase, atmospheres explosibles. Great pronunciation there, as you can hear. But basically what that is it's a regulatory framework for equipment that's intended to be used in potentially explosive environments. So it's somewhat equivalent to our, hazardous location ratings that we have over here in the US that we'll talk about a little bit later. So certainly in the last several years, ATEX has been a mark that you see much more frequently here in the US, maybe than we saw it a few years ago. And a new one that I just saw on a Horner product a little while ago, and I had to look up, was UKCA, and that is UK Conformity Assessed. So I believe it's more or less the equivalent of ATEX out of the UK, probably stemming from the fact that since the UK has exited from the EU, they probably needed a mark of their own. So those are some marks that you'll see coming out of Europe. The next one I want to talk about, I'm just kind of throwing it in here, is a specialized certification. So this one is for a specialized market, and I'm bringing it up because some of the Horner products have this mark, and that is ABS, or the American Bureau of Shipping. And as you would imagine, with a name like American Bureau of Shipping, this is a certification that's geared towards products that are in the marine industry or maybe offshore type equipment. So, as I just mentioned, several Horner products have this certification. Now, it can't be used in every application, in the marine type environment. For instance, not for propulsion. There are some limitations, but again, there are several Horner products that carry the ABS certification. So that's a specialized one, not necessarily tied to any particular geography, because I believe it's a global certification. And there are other certifications for marine or in the marine industry that I have not mentioned here. We've talked about Europe. CE ATEX are, kind of have their origins in Europe. Now let's talk about some things that are a little more North American centric. Let's start with OSHA, even though that's not necessarily a mark that you'll see on a product. But OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It's part of the U.S. Department of Labor. And I think around here in North America, or at least in the U.S., we think of it as kind of the workplace safety police. Obviously, workplace safety is very important. And OSHA is the organization that is responsible for setting and enforcing U.S. standards in that area. Now, one of the things that comes under OSHA's jurisdiction, I believe, is the National Electric Code, which is something that those of us in the automation industry are at least somewhat familiar with. So that's the U.S. standard for the safe installation of electrical wiring and equipment. All right. And typically it's enforced at the state level. Is typically what you find, or the state or local level, right? Your local building code inspector or your local building inspector, part of what he's doing is enforcing the National Electrical Code as part of his job responsibilities. And then, of course, there's the equivalent in Canada, the Canadian Electrical Code. That's the Canadian standard, of course, and it's enforced at the provincial level. So again, certainly, even though these aren't marks you will find on a product, OSHA, the NEC, and the CEC are important acronyms for us to understand. Okay, now this is one of the big messages for today, and that is we really need to understand the purpose of a nationally recognized testing laboratory. Okay, so what is a nationally recognized testing laboratory? Well, it's a private sector organization that is officially recognized by OSHA to perform certification against certain standards. So you see on the page here, on the slide, several different NRTLs, not all of them, but several. And while they tend to have their own specializations, there's a ton of overlap. So it's very common for there to be a certain standard which multiple NRTLs are authorized to certify against, And OSHA has authorized all of these NRTLs to provide certifications against these standards. So again, if you have a set of standards and you have multiple NRTLs that can certify against those standards, then those certifications are equivalent. So whether it has the UL mark or the ETL mark or the FM mark, if it was certified by that particular NRTL against the same standard, it's equivalent. And that's something I think we forget. And one of the main reasons we forget that, and one of the reasons it is such a cause for confusion, is because a number of the standards that we use here in the US in the automation industry are UL standards. But UL is the safekeeper of the standard. They're not the only NRTL that can certify against that standard. Now, let's talk about some of the more common standards that we run into that are UL standards. First being ordinary location, and that is effectively installing a system in an unclassified area. In other words, there's nothing really special about the area. And then, of course, that's UL 508. And then, of course, we have UL 698, which is the hazardous location or classified type standard. So those are the two most common that you hear talked about in industry, UL 508, ordinary location, and UL 698, which is hazardous location. Okay, next let's take a little bit deeper dive into the hazardous location rating. So those are divided into class, division, and group. Let's start with class. So there's class 1, class 2, and class 3, and that basically defines what could be in the environment. So with class 1, you're talking about flammable gases or vapors. With class 2, you're talking about combustible dust. And with class 3, it would be easily ignitable fibers. Okay, so that's the class level. And then when you specify division for the standard, now you're talking about whether the concentrations of the gas or the dust is combustible normally or it's combustible on an abnormal situation. So division 1 is ignitable under normal operation, whereas division 2 is ignitable under abnormal situations. So that is kind of the division there. And the group just specifies the different types that you can run into of the different gases, vapors, or dust, that sort of thing. That's UL hazardous location. And Horner products are most typically rated class 1 div 2 groups A, B, C, and D. So typically for that flammable gas or vapor type environment. Now let's talk about enclosure ratings. This is another one we run into pretty quickly. And early in my career, about the only ones I would run into were the NEMA ratings. And NEMA, I believe, is an association of electrical manufacturers. And NEMA, for many years, published their standards for enclosure ratings for the environment for the enclosure. And there are a bunch of NEMA ratings, maybe a dozen or so, and I'm showing you 4 of the most common here on the chart. But with NEMA, this is a manufacturer self-certifying type situation. So NEMA set the standard, and manufacturers would basically publish, hey, we meet NEMA 12, we meet NEMA 4X, those sorts of things. And that's still true today. Now, out of the IEC group came the IP rating system, which is a little more complex in that you have a 2-digit system where the first digit talks about the protection from solid objects, and the second digit talks about the protection from moisture. So IP65 would mean it's dust tight and then protected against water jets, as an example. But of course, you also have IP66 and IP67 and all those sorts of ratings as well. Now, what about UL type ratings? What is that all about? They seem to line up with NEMA, but what's the difference? UL type ratings do line up with NEMA type ratings. However, the only real difference is this. If you're looking for a UL type rating on your product, then it just means that your product has to be tested by an NRTL against the standard. You can't just certify and have a UL type 4X rating, for instance. You could have a NEMA 4X rating by self-certifying, but not a UL type 4X rating. If you want that UL type 4X rating, then you need to go to an NRTL to get that certification testing done. So that's the difference there. So again, this was a short look at a lot of the markings and organizations that we run into in the industrial area today, and this is the big takeaway. I talked about a couple slides ago, what is an NRTL, a Nationally Regulated Test Laboratory, and how does that differ from certification or from standard? Well, the big thing is this, right? Many of the standards we use in industry are UL standards, but that doesn't mean that only UL can provide certification against a UL standard. Any NRTL that has been authorized by OSHA can provide that certification. So you could have a Class 1 Division 2 hazardous location requirement that you need a product to be certified for, but you could go to a product that carries the UL mark against that standard, the ETL Intertech mark against that standard, or maybe even a CSA mark against that standard, and there's probably more. So again, the lab that does the testing is not the same as the standard. So if the standard is the same, the certification is the same, even if the mark looks a little bit different. That's our big takeaway for today. Okay, this is the one last thing I wanted to cover, and that is, where can you find certification info at Horner? Well, you can go to our website, as you might expect. You can go under Resources. You'll find an entry called Certifications. Or if you want to just go directly to the particular URL, I've got it there on the screen. And from there, you can find UL certificates. You can find our Declaration of Conformities. You can find all kinds of information on the Horner certifications page about what certifications the Horner products carry. Okay, well, I hope today was informative, even though it was a very short video. Okay, this is the point of the program where I remind you that we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, whether we're fully live or whether we're pre-recorded. And we always have folks standing by to answer your questions. If you're watching live, just give us those questions in the chat section, if you're watching on replay like a lot of folks do, give us those comments and questions in the comment section, and we'll get back to you just as soon as we can. Okay, a reminder, don't hesitate to sign up for training. Here are the next training classes that are scheduled for 2024. And what's exciting is we're opening up a new OCS training center, which is a new facility where we're doing training in Indianapolis. So I believe that the basic course held in June is going to be the first course at the new training center. So that is exciting. Okay, there's lots of opportunity to interact with us online at Horner Automation. You can go to our website, to our YouTube channel, or interact with us on LinkedIn. Now, next week, we're going back to our more technical videos, and we'll be going through BACnet MSTP. So BACnet stands for Building Automation and Control. It is a very popular protocol in the building automation market. And there are some different variations of BACnet. There's BACnet over Ethernet called BACnet IP, and there's also BACnet over serial called BACnet MSTP. That's still very common. So that's what we're going to review because that's recently been added to the Micro OCS series of products. Okay. Well, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, don't hesitate to do so. It doesn't cost anything. And if you choose notifications when you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we post a new video. Okay, so until next week, let's all get out there and do us some good.